Okay, well, we're going to get started here. I'm going to share my screen, share PowerPoint. All right, so hopefully everyone can see this. If anyone's having issues, type in the chat. Thank you all for coming today. We're going to be doing our Aquatic Weed Watcher Workshop presentation. And let's see, we got something. Okay, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, no problem, Mark. Like we've done in years past, we're just going to be going through some aquatic invasive species that we're asking you to keep an eye out for. We'll go through how to identify them, and we can at the end address control strategies, but primarily this workshop is going to be to learn how to identify these weeds, understand why they're bad for habitat and for our aquatic ecosystems, and then also learn how to report them. Okay, so we're going to just do a round of introductions here. So my name is Tyler Pedersen. I'm the Invasive Species Program Coordinator at the Tualatin SWCD.
I'm Olivia Hurd, Invasive Species Technician at Tualatin SWCD.
And my name is Eli Staggs. I'm an Invasive Species Technician at Tualatin SWCD as well.
Okay, so we're just going to kind of start with some basics, and some of this you probably already know, but so the area that we're kind of responsible for when we're doing a lot of our weed control and our outreach is the Tualatin River Watershed. And, this is a beautiful area. Primarily Washington County. We do some work in Multnomah County as well. But this watershed, this is where all the water drains down into the basin. We've got many different communities that live here. There's varying topography. We've got the coast range as you go towards the west. We've got the Willamette Valley, and you've got the skyline hills, Forest Heights area. So very diverse topography. And the main thing that's connecting everything is the Tualatin River. And we're going to have a chance to get out there on Saturday and explore. So really looking forward to that. So just a little bit about the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. Our service area is Washington County. We've been around since 1955, and we're one of 45 soil and water conservation districts in the state. And we work with residents. We help our community implement sustainable solutions to conserve and enhance natural resources. We provide technical assistance, financial assistance, and education programs. In our invasive species program, we've been around since 2018. So we've been, this is year 5. And we do a lot of work controlling and surveying target species like the ones you're going to see today. We do a lot of work increasing public awareness, and then we collaborate with partners and residents to prevent the spread of invasive species. So some of the things that we offer in our program: we provide a lot of technical assistance and advice for controlling common weeds. We just recently began offering a weed wrangling 101 workshop this year that addresses more common weeds. We do a lot of survey and control for early detection rapid response weeds, or EDRR weeds, That's a term that you're going to hear about throughout this presentation. We have a tool library of weed wrenches. So landowners that live in Washington County can check those out and use them to pull up Scotch broom, holly, other invasive trees. And then lastly, we provide these weed watcher workshops to community members, land managers, city, state entities like you're watching today. And the Tualatin Watershed Invasive Species Team, or TWIST, Defenders of Habitat. This is a partnership between residents, volunteers, nonprofits, and government agencies. Volunteers and staff look for and report EDRR species in the Tualatin River watershed. And by taking this workshop, you are now a part of our team. So welcome aboard. And you might have already been part of our team before, so welcome back. All right, so this is a great infographic that kind of breaks down, why weeds are so bad and the impacts that they can have on the environment, on biodiversity, infrastructure. So that there at the far left, that's a healthy ecosystem. We see native pollinators, we see healthy, riparian plants, turtles, ducks. We see in the background there's some viable egg land in production. And then as we go to the right, the invasive species, in this case, it's the dreaded knotweed, which I'll be talking about here a little bit later, is slowly beginning to take over. And when it starts to take over, that degrades the habitat. It reduces plant biodiversity, plants for pollinators. It can come up through the foundation of homes. It can damage sidewalks and asphalt. And so many of these things happen if these invasives are left unchecked. So that's why we're trying to educate people about them and trying to respond before they can get out of hand and cause this damage. All right, so this is a cool looking graph here. This is the invasion curve. And what you can see here is on the bottom, we've got the different stages of management. So we go from prevention to detection and removal, containment, and finally long-term management. And then on the left there, we have the size of the infestation and management costs. So that's going to go up as we progress through the stages of management. So what we're really focused on, a lot of our efforts, is to try to prevent infestations from getting started in the first place, obviously, but then also doing a lot of detection and removal. So that early detection, rapid response. So lower part of the curve for weeds that aren't as widespread, like for instance, knotweed, or in some areas, I guess puncture vine is another one that we're dealing with. It's not an aquatic weed, but it's one that's not as widespread. And then as you go up the curve, those weeds are going to be like blackberry, Scotch broom. These are weeds that are kind of have gotten out of the box, so to speak, and are more widespread and going to be harder to control. And it's going to cost a lot more to get rid of them. So we're trying to eradicate and contain early on so that these weeds don't cause problems down the road and end up getting out of hand, kind of like with blackberry and ivy. We want to knock them back and make sure they don't cause any of that harm to those habitats and infrastructure and livelihoods. So really important to get them early. This is an infographic that kind of goes through the same thing and just showing the different stages of the early detection, rapid response. We got prevention, so that could be like cleaning your shoes, using local firewood, in the case of like with the emerald ash borers, use local firewood, don't move it around. And then don't dispose of unwanted plants or pets in nature. A good example would be people releasing Redeared Slider turtles into ponds and wetlands, and then they kind of, can reproduce and spread. The next stage is the removal and detection. So this is where you're learning how to identify weeds, reporting your sightings, having a professional come in and survey and map out the infestations. And then finally, you're doing the removal, disposing of the weed debris, researching new control methods. The next one is containment. So this is where agencies coordinate to prevent the spread of the infestation. And they continue to remove the invasive species. And then finally, management, where you're kind of prioritizing economic and ecological impact. And this is where complete removal is no longer feasible. So the key is to act fast and keep an eye out, stay vigilant when looking for these weeds. Okay, so this is what we call integrated pest management pyramid. And so each section represents different control methods that are used to control noxious weeds. And at the bottom, so that's going to be the biggest one, is prevention. And these would include, like I mentioned before, practices like brushing your boots, not composting invasive plant fragments. And then the next one is cultural. So this is where you're suppressing weeds by removing the requirements for their survival. So that could be understanding kind of how their biology works, so that you can try to shade them out. So if you're planting trees, you can help shade out blackberry is a good example. You could use cover crops to reduce weeds in your egg fields. The next one up is physical and mechanical. This is where you're physically pulling up plants. You could be using equipment for mowing, weed whacking, tilling. The next one is biological control. And so this is referring to using insects that are natural enemies from the invasive plants native range that can feed on it. And usually there's extensive research that's done before they do any of these releases, so there's no off-target damage to other species. And lastly, we've got chemicals. So this would be herbicides. So this is kind of the smallest portion of the IPM pyramid. It's part of a larger suite of tools that you can use. And usually you use it only when it's necessary. It's not usually a first option, but for certain weeds, it may be the best option, for instance, with woody knotweed. But it's a tool in our toolbox, and we try to be safe when we're doing that kind of treatment. So that goes through the IPM pyramid. Next, I wanted to kind of go through, there's going to be some terminology that's being thrown around during this presentation with each of these weeds, and I want to make sure you're kind of familiar with that. So first off, we've got emergent or immersed aquatic vegetation. So in this case, this is purple loosestrife. So this is where a majority of the plant will grow above the water surface, and they're usually rooted in the water, or in saturated or inundated soil. The next one is submerged or submersed. Example here is Leafy Alodia. And this is where a majority of the plant grows below the water surface, and it may be bottom rooted or free floating. The last one is floating. Example here is yellow floating heart. And these are free floating leaves, leaved plants, and they're not anchored in the sediment. And then we've got the floating leaf plants that are rooted in the sediment. So these are the different terms that you'll hear throughout the presentation. And I was going to kind of kick it off by talking about our first species to report, and this would be woody knotweed. So this is a weed that usually, once you get to know what it looks like, they call it like a 50-mile-an-hour plant. You'll see it driving down the road and it'll just pop out, because mainly, especially this time of year, it's very tall and it's got big leaves and the flowers will start forming, and it's very it's kind of a red flag. It's something that you'll notice for sure once you get an eye for it. So this plant is actually native to Japan, and it's known to come up in the lava fields. So it's very hardy, very resilient. And it was brought over probably as an ornamental. It kind of looks similar to bamboo. It's got that hollow stem, bigger leaves, good shade plant. So unfortunately, it's very good at spreading. And it got over here, and especially where we see it along rivers and streams, it's what we call disturbance adapted. So once you get any erosion, bank erosion, any little fragment or root can float downstream and start new plants elsewhere. So usually the things you want to look for are you've got this flattened or heart-shaped leaf. You've got these small white flowers that are going to start to form right about now. And like I said, they've got these large bamboo-like stems. The best time to look for this plant is usually late spring to early fall. You'll really start seeing it when it starts to grow tall in early to midsummer. August to October, that's typically the time that we're doing our treatments for this invasive. And you'll see it on stream edges, roadsides, wetlands, and gardens. And like I was mentioning before, it doesn't really do a good job holding the soil together, so you'll tend to see more erosion where you see this plant. So that can impact, property, habitat. When you get a lot of this plant in one area, sure, the bees will use it, but it doesn't last that long. So it doesn't provide that long-term window for pollinator food sources. And then the leaves, when they fall off, as we get into the fall, they're not really readily broken down by macroinvertebrates. So they're not used up like some of our native plants are, broken down or in sync with the different pollinator life stages. So really something that just changes the habitat, the structure, can increase erosion. It can also decrease property values and come up through the foundation of houses. So it can cause damage that way. But if you see this plant anywhere in Oregon, report it. We'll get to that at the end and how you can report it. But it's something to really keep an eye out for, and something we might see on Saturday as well, for sure. Some of the lookalikes here, we've got red Osure Dogwood. This is a Pacific Northwest native. And the main differences here are that the red Osure Dogwood, it has this red stem. It's not hollow, it's solid. It's got smaller leaves, it's not as tall. And it's got this kind of tighter cluster of white flowers, whereas the knotweed flowers are more kind of cascading out, splayed out in a wider area. So we often sometimes get people misidentifying the dogwood for knotweed, but fortunately it's a native. It's a good plant. So if you see it, it's a good sign. All right, I'm going to pass it off to Eli.
All right. So this species that I'm going to talk about is purple loosestrife. And if you spend a lot of time on the water on the Tualatin, this might be a familiar looking plant. This is something we'll likely potentially see on Saturday when we're out boating together. This is a common aquatic invasive species in Washington County, and it's one that poses a pretty significant threat to our wetlands and slow-moving waterways. This plant was originally brought over as an ornamental. That's going to be a pretty common theme amongst many of the species that we talk about tonight. And just from the appearance of this plant, you could understand why. It has these really vibrant beautiful pink to purple flowers that grow on these spikes that can get up to 2 feet long. And with all of those flowers, and on a mature plant, all of those flowers will eventually turn to seed. And what is pretty astounding about purple loosestrife is on a large mature plant, one that looks something like the top right photo there, a plant like that can produce over 2 million seeds a year. And those seeds will drop pretty close to the parent plant, and it can move into water, but it can also be windborne. They can be carried distances away from the plant. And so that amount of seed and a pretty high success rate in terms of germination leads to a very destructive plant that outcompetes native vegetation. It displaces those really valuable native riparian species, and it decreases the amount of habitat and food sourcing for songbirds and waterfowl throughout the year. And it can also negatively impact juvenile salmon habitat. So it can clog irrigation, and it reduces the amount of available oxygen in water systems when this plant grows and then decomposes in the winter when it drops all of its leaves. That amount of, that much vegetation in the system can lead to some pretty harmful consequences. And so what you want to be looking for, as I mentioned, are these large plants with spiked flower heads. And I'm going to talk about some lookalikes because we have a couple native species that look a lot like purple loosestrife, but pink to purple flowers that grow on tall spikes. They have leaves are mostly opposite along the stem, or they're whirled around. And if you were to go up and you wanted to confirm that you're looking at purple loosestrife and you touch the stem, it will be a square stem. And right now in August, we are in the height of purple loosestrife flowering stage. They start as early as June and can go all the way into September. And where to look, anywhere that the soil is moist. We list here wetlands, riparian, urban areas, and roadsides, and gardens. And because we recently found a population in gardens, and it doesn't necessarily have to be standing water. It can be found in a very wide range of locations. And purple loosestrife has a couple of native lookalikes. The biggest lookalike is going to be Douglas spirea. This is a plant that grows in a very similar habitat as purple loosestrife does, moist systems, but Douglas spirea can also be found in very wide range of areas. But what is similar about the two, especially from a distance, are these pink cone-shaped flower structures. And Douglas spirea from the distance looks very close, but when you walk up towards it, you'll notice that rather than purple loosestrife's narrow spike shape, Douglas spirea flares out and it creates more of a cone, and it has a fuzzier appearance to it, whereas purple loosestrife has these very identifiable feature of petals and flowers along its spike. And then one other native species that could confuse you for purple loosestrife is fireweed. Fireweed is, again, pink to purple flowers, and they grow on these spikes, but fireweed will grow in recently disturbed forested areas where maybe there's been a clear cut or a logging operation. It grows in drier soils. Fireweed prefers habitats that purple loosestrife does not thrive in. So if you see pink to purple flowers on the side of a very dry hillside away from water, you're likely looking at fireweed, but always worth having a second inspection and confirming between the two. Something that's interesting about purple loosestrife is the availability of biocontrols for controlling the species. We mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that we weren't going to go into too much detail about the control strategies. We can answer questions about that at the end, but we wanted to just highlight that purple loosestrife is a plant where there are natural, in its native range, there are natural predators that provide a check and balance on its size of population in its native range. And those checks and balances were brought here and introduced into Washington County. And these biocontrols will only feed on purple loosestrife. They don't affect any other species. And these two beetles, well, this beetle and this weevil, one will attack the roots and one will attack the leaves. And there are these little insects that do a lot of work for us to control this species. And so if you're ever observing purple loosestrife and you want to report it, one thing that can be helpful information is if you notice damage to the leaves that looks similar to the top right photo here, presence of biocontrol is a good thing. But just wanted to let everyone be aware that these are out there. And one thing to note about biocontrols, just as a general concept and idea, is that they're not introduced necessarily for eradication. They're introduced to maintain population levels to a minimum so that species like purple loosestrife don't become the dominant species in a system, in an ecosystem, because eradication won't happen because these biocontrols feed on the plant, and so they need a food source. So they don't want to eat all of it. They'll leave a little bit left behind so that the next year when they come back up, when they come back up and they're ready for another spring, summer, and fall of feeding on purple loosestrife, they have a food source. So eradication won't be achieved with biocontrol, but a very consistent level of reduction is there. So the next species is Parrot Feather. Like I mentioned, a common theme, things are introduced as ornamentals. This one is unique because ornamental within the aquarium trade. So this is a very sought after plant to include in your aquariums because it grows very easily, grows very quickly. And unfortunately, when people have aquariums and they no longer want them, often what can happen is those aquariums are dumped into our waterways. And that is a major vector and major introduction of non-native species to our aquatic ecosystems, are those dumping of aquariums where you're letting go of your frogs, your fish, and then among those animals are all the plants that you had in there. And so parrot feather was one of those. And infestations of parrot feather can completely cover bodies of water and smother out other native aquatic species. You can see an example here down in the bottom left of this photo. There is just a swarm of parrot feather. And what parrot feather also does in terms of a threat is that it can block these slow-moving waterways and increase the amount of sedimentation in any slow-moving waterway that is there. And then also it creates great mosquito breeding habitats. So if you had an infestation of parrot feather in a public pond where there's a lot of access and activity, that can become a human health hazard. So parrot feather is a species that we definitely want to have reports of if it's found anywhere in Oregon because of these negative impacts. There are, fortunately, one thing that is working to our advantage with parrot feather is that both male and female plants are needed for seed. But as far as we are aware of at this moment, only the female parrot feathers are present in Oregon, which means that the only way that this plant can reproduce is through stem fragmentation. So if a piece of this plant detaches and drifts itself downstream, they can start a new population of parrot feather, which is still a hurdle or an obstacle to control this species, but we're only fighting half the battle there. And one thing to note, or what you want to be looking for with parrot feather, are these bright green feathery leaves that are arranged in a whorl around the stem. And the easiest time to identify this plant is going to be around this time of year, maybe even starting as far as July. But when the water levels start to recede, you'll be able to see those bright green feathery leaf structures starting to poke themselves above the water surface and reveal themselves for some pretty easy identification. If it's earlier in the season, you might not see these leaf structures because they're going to be submersed under all the water there. And They do have flowers, but they are so small and tucked away that really flowers are not going to be a really strong way to identify this plant, but really it's those feathery, bright green leaves that are arranged in a whorl around the stem are going to be your key identifying feature for parrot feather. Okay. Our next species, which is Leafy Alodia, which is found in Washington County and is a plant we want to find, we want to gather reports on. We want to find reports anywhere in Oregon, but in Washington County, there is a very limited distribution of Leafy Alodia. So we want to get on top of this and hopefully get to a point where this plant does not become as common in our waterways as purple loosestrife or knotweed has been able to establish itself. And we want to get on top of it because infestations of Leafy Alodia, similar to parrot feather, quickly overwhelm these native ecosystem or native aquatic ecosystems. Leafy Alodia grows really rapidly and it changes the amount of available resources in the water for other native plants and fish along the way. And with how quickly this plant grows and how much vegetation it builds up in waterways, when all of that decomposes, that process of decomposition consumes a lot of the available oxygen in our waterways. So populations of Leafy Alodia reduce the amount of dissolved oxygen in water, and that's very negative to our native fish and amphibian populations. So we want to get on top of any Leafy Alodia populations that are in Washington County. And also in terms of just recreation, that amount of vegetation can impede our public waterways for swimming and for boating. It's kind of a pain to try and paddle through super dense, slow moving, shallow water that is just full of invasive species like Leafy Alodia. So again, please report it if you see it in Washington County. And what you want to look for with this plant is that it's a submerged perennial plant that grows in water, and it's usually in water that can be shallow but up to 7 to 8 feet deep. And it grows in these massive dense mats that can flow up towards the water surface. It has stems that will reach down to the soil, but what you're going to probably interact and notice first are these really dense mats right at the water surface. And if you pull that out of the water and you started to look at it, you're going to notice that the leaves of this plant are arranged in whorls of 4 to 8. It has a pretty variable amount of leaves that grow on the stem, but it's most commonly found in whorls of 4. So on one cross section of the stem, you'd have 4 leaves around. And it's got these dark green leaves and parallel veins, and then the edges of the leaf, the margin of that leaf is smooth, and that's going to be a key distinction with some other invasive species or other species that are out in the waterway. So a key into having smooth edges with 4 whorled leaves. And then when this plant is flowering, you're going to see these white 3-petaled flowers that grow on a stem above the water. And you want to look for this plant during the warm summer months when the water levels have receded, because then you'll be able to see those populations closer to the water surface. And this plant will grow in ponds and lakes, slow-moving streams and rivers. So a pretty wide range of aquatic ecosystems. This plant does have a look-alike, and the look-alike for Leafy Alodia is the Canadian waterweed. It's another Alodia species, but what is different is Leafy Alodia has leaves of 4 to 8 per whorl, and it is a much larger plant with longer leaves, but this other, our native waterweed, our native Alodia, have 3 leaves per whorl. And so that is a key distinction between these two species. Next up is water hyacinth. This is one that we know is present along the Tualatin River. Olivia and I found some water hyacinth last summer. So it's possible that this Saturday, if we had our eyes peeled, we might be able to detect water hyacinth. This was, a plant that it can completely cover the water surface. Almost all of these invasive species that we're talking about tonight can grow very quickly and cover our water surfaces, and it blocks light for all of our native submerged vegetation. It displaces our floating native vegetation. This plant will outcompete other plants very easily, and it impedes waterfowl and other wildlife from using bodies of water. And large infestations, as you can see in this bottom photo here, could make recreating in public waters impossible. So if you like to paddle in slow moving sections of river or stream, or if it was, in an inlet or in ponds, lakes, anywhere that water hyacinth can grow, you're not going to have a very fun time trying to paddle through that. So that's it's a reason for concern with water hyacinth. And then it can also, again, provide pretty prime mosquito breeding habitat. And this is a plant that if you find anywhere in Oregon, we're going to want to have reports of. And what you're looking for with water hyacinth is this perennial floating plant, and it can grow up to 3 feet tall from the water surface. And when it is in flower, it has these lavender to pink colored flowers that have 6 petals, and they're very showy and they can stand out, very easy to ID, especially that contrast against, especially on the Tualatin River, that brown water, a pink flower stands out very quickly. So that's one way to key into water hyacinth. And then it has these very shiny, spongy leaves that can be almost twisted and contorted at times. And they grow in rosettes from a floating bulb. So they grow, sorry, not a rosette, but the leaves grow in a spiral from this floating bulb on the water surface. And so with all those combinations or all those characteristics combined together, if you observe that, you're going to be looking at water hyacinth. And right now is a prime time to observe water hyacinth, early as June and into September. You want to be looking for those flowers and those tall leaves. So warm summer months is the best time to observe this plant. And it is found in rivers, streams, lakes, and ponds, and any area that's sheltered from cold temperatures. And one thing to note is that this plant is sold in Oregon as a pond plant. So if you're having any planting projects where you're trying to vegetate a pond of your own, or have a neighbor who's vegetating, steer them away from water hyacinth, because it can escape those contained ecosystems and move their way into native aquatic ecosystems. Creeping water primrose is another species of concern for us, and this is one that if you find anywhere in Oregon, not just Washington County, we would love to hear reports of, because creeping water primrose, like all the other species that we've been talking about, form incredibly dense mats that you can see in the bottom of this photo that overwhelm our aquatic communities. It slows the water flow and increases the amount of stagnation along our waterways. This plant decreases habitat quality for our fish and other aquatic wildlife. And there are large populations of this plant on the Willamette River and adjacent river systems. So this is one that is present. If you paddle out there, you might observe this. And we want to keep any introductions to Washington County to where it hasn't been introduced out of there. So at the end of this presentation, we're going to talk about ways that you can keep your boats clean, but we are also vectors of these plants too. So be careful about accidentally transporting plant fragments around. But what you want to look for with creeping water primrose is that this is a floating perennial species. So this grows above the water surface. And the leaves of this plant are unique in that they have 2 growth forms. So when the leaves are growing on a flowering stem, the leaves grow in more of a lance shaped. You can see that in the top left photo underneath that flower. Those leaves are longer and they're pointed at the end and they look closer to a lance. And then the leaves that are growing on the horizontal stems that are spreading out across the water, those are more round to egg-shaped in form. So if you ran across a population of creeping water primrose and you saw all these different leaf structures, that would explain what's going on there, is that it has two growth habits. And the flowers of this plant are yellow and they are 5 to 6 petaled, and they bloom between July and September. And those flowers are going to be one of the quickest ways to identify this plant. And these leaves of this plant are visible from as early as April all the way into October. But again, easiest to spot when it's in bloom from July through early September. Creeping water primrose does have a native look-alike, which is our water primrose or marsh seed box. And how you distinguish these two species is the leaves of creeping water primrose are arranged alternately along the stems of the plant, and our native water primrose have leaves that are arranged oppositely along the stem. And our native water primrose has small greenish flowers, and our creeping water, the invasive creeping water primrose, has those bright yellow flowers. Next up is yellow floating heart, and yellow floating heart is historically was cultivated as a pond ornamental plant, and it grows in these dense stands that decrease our native plant and animal biodiversity. Familiar story. It impedes our flows of irrigation canals, and it can limit the recreation available in water bodies for boating, and again increases those mosquito populations. And this is a priority species for eradication in Oregon, so please report it if you find anywhere in Oregon and Washington County. And what you want to be looking for with this plant is it is a floating species like our native pond lily, but this plant has the underside of the leaves are purple tinted, which is a key distinction between yellow floating heart and our native pond lily. So if you're poning around and you're not sure, lift up one of those leaves, look at the underside of it, and check to see what color the bottom of the leaf is. If it is purple tinted, you're probably looking at the invasive. If it's not, you're probably looking at the native. The flowers of yellow floating heart, as the name suggests, are yellow and are comprised of 5 fringed petals, and those will rise out of the water about 1 to 3 inches. This plant, though, with flowers, and it can produce seed, this plant primarily spreads by rhizome or stem fragments. So if you're boating around and you notice an infestation of yellow floating heart, you don't want to try to rip it all out and pull it into your boat. You want to leave that be. You can report it. There'll be some follow-up work, but if pieces of that plant break off and move downstream, they can start new populations. And you want to look for this plant. It's easiest to observe when it's in flower, and that's between May and October. But what is unique and interesting about this plant is that the flowers, once they bloom, are only visible for a single day. That doesn't mean that there's only one day in the year that a population of floating heart you'll see the flower. It'll continue to create new flowers throughout that season, but one individual flower is only there for one day. And the leaves of this plant are visible all the way from April to October, and those flowers bloom May through October, but the height of it is in June through August. Like I mentioned, this does have that native look-alike, our Pacific Northwest native yellow pond lily. And the distinction between those two are the tints of the underside of those leaves are the best way to quickly tell the difference between the two. Okay, the next species is fragrant water lily. And again, like our other species, fragrant water lily grows very quickly. It forms these dense mats which crowd out our native ecosystems. And then the decomposition of all of those leaves and all that biomass decreases the amount of dissolved oxygen available in our waterways. So that negatively impacts our fish and amphibian habitat again. And this is one that if you find anywhere in Washington County, we would love a report of. Fragrant water lily has very, very showy, beautiful flowers that are very fragrant, and they range in color from white to pink. And those bloom between March and October. So a very wide range of time for fragrant water lily to bloom. And those flowers will open early in the morning and close around noon. So all you paddlers who are out there early in the morning will be our most helpful allies in trying to identify fragrant water lily populations. If you go out in the evening time, you might not be able to see these flowers. So one thing to know also is that these leaves are leathery green on top and purplish underneath. And this is sold in Oregon as a pond plant. So this is something that you might find in private ponds. Always helpful to just let people know what kind of risk fragrant water lily poses to our native ecosystems. So just be aware that it is available out there. And it does grow in ponds, lakes, and slow streams. And our next species is the yellow water lily. And yellow water lily is a floating perennial plant that forms dense mats, crowds out native species, reduces the amount of level of dissolved oxygen. All of these plants are they don't have the same checks and balances as our native vegetation has. So these grow out of control and take over waterways. And what you want to look for in yellow water lily are round leaves that are flat on the water surface, and they float, and they have a large slit. So they look a lot like native pond lily. The leaves are bright green on top, and they actually are underneath a mottled brown with a red to purple coloring underneath. And these have much larger yellow flowers than the yellow floating heart, or any of the other yellow floating species. These have pretty large yellow flowers. And the leaves of this plant grow from March to October. And this flower also blooms from March to October. And they will open, fragrant water lily opens up in the morning and closes around noon. Yellow water lily opens up around midday and then closes later on in the afternoon. And this plant can tolerate full sun to shade. So anywhere on a pond or a lake or slow stream, there's a chance that yellow water lily is present. And the last species that I'm going to talk about is Delta Arrowhead. Delta Arrowhead is, we have not found any populations of Delta Arrowhead in Washington County yet, but they are in the Portland metro area. So with that sort of proximity, there is a chance for populations of this plant to be in Washington County. So having your eyes out on the waterways to be keen observers can help us get an early detection, so we can get a rapid response on this plant and make sure that it doesn't get to a point where it dominates our ecosystems, because much like all the other species, Delta Arrowhead overwhelms. It doesn't have checks and balances. It produces an extensive amount of seed, and it has the ability to spread through underground rhizomes. So it has a lot of tools in its toolbox to quickly dominate our native waterways and displace all of our desirable vegetation. And Delta Arrowhead is an emergent perennial, so that means that it likes to root itself in mud and shallow water and then send up these above ground leaves, or excuse me, not above ground, above water leaves. And those above water leaves are lance or oval shaped, and the submerged leaves that are left below are more grass-like, but the thing to key into are going to be these lance to oval shaped leaves. And we do have other species that have lance to oval shaped leaves. So you want to go one step further and try to find their flowers. And this plant has white flowers that grow in whorls of 3. So there's always going to be 3 flowers together, and they each have 3 petals, and they grow at the end of these leafless stalks. So you'll have these lanced oval shaped leaves, and then there'll be a stalk shooting out, and then there'll be 3 flowers together, and each one of those will have 3 petals. The best time to observe and get a confident identification of Delta Arrowhead is in June through September when it is flowering. I still am constantly tripped up with Delta Arrowhead. We have native species that look like it, and you really, for your best chance of ID, you want to be able to identify those flowers. And you want to look anywhere along the edges of any waterway or wetland. Okay.
Okay, well, we are going to transition into some animals. So the first one is going to be zebra mussels. So zebra mussels can have a huge impact on our waterway. They can attach to and clog man-made structures, particularly pipelines, dams, and water intakes. So they could do a huge disservice to our dams that we have, and any water intakes for cities or other municipalities. They have no natural predators, and their populations can outcompete other filter feeders for resources and food, thus killing off some of our native mussels. This is a federally listed species, so across the entire United States, it is a species that we would like to have reported. The species is small and triangular shaped. The shells have yellow and brown stripes, and they're smaller than the Quagga mussels, but the 2 of them look pretty identical. You'll see in the next slide where we talk about the Quagga mussels. You can look for this year round because they like to hitch rides on recreation gear, particularly boats, motorboats, where they have bilge pumps. They can get inside. So just making sure that all of our boating equipment is clean. They typically are found in freshwater lakes, rivers, canals, and ponds, and most often, like I said, transported by trailered boats. So here's the Quagga mussel. It's also tinier, small, and triangular shaped. It has very similar areas that it can take hold. So on those man-made structures, particularly the pipelines, dams, and water intakes. And like the zebra mussel, it does not have any natural predators here. And so their populations outcompete all of our native mussels and other filter feeders that we have in our systems. Their shells have yellow and brown stripes, though they're hard to differentiate all the time from the zebra mussels. They are also federally listed. So whether you have Quagga mussels or zebra mussels, they're both reported the same way, and someone else can do the ID for us. They're both small, and so it's just easiest to just report them both if you see anything that you think could be either a Quagga or a zebra mussel. You can look for this year round, and it's also found in freshwater lakes, rivers, canals, and ponds, typically on those trailered boats. And likely both of these species got to the Great Lakes in the bilge pumps of some of those big shipping boats that have brought over like shipping containers. because they can hide out inside, and then they release the water in those bilges, and it releases these critters as well. So the next species is mud snails. So these are tiny, and they're right-hand coiled shells with 5 to 6 whorls. So in this top right photo, you can see where the opening is. Those coils go to the right away from that opening. So it kind of differentiates it from some of our other little snails that hang out in our waterways that are native. The colors can range from light to dark brown. This can be found year-round, and during cold weather or dry conditions, it will burrow into the mud. So even if a pond dries down, they can still survive by burrowing down into the mud of those ponds. It displaces animals that are food sources for salmon, steelhead, and trout, which are important species to our Native Americans and to our local people. It really likes to hang out in brackish and freshwater lakes, rivers, canals, and ponds, and it's often found on mud, rocks, plants, and wood. They just attach to those. And like some of our last species we were talking about, it also is easily transported by trailered boats, but also debris, boots, and nets. So if you have fishing gear or kayaks or canoes, this is easily transported. So make sure that you drain dry your boats. And there are some populations of mud snails, not here in Washington County, but on the coast. So if you ever take your kayaks or equipment over to the coast area, just be aware that there are mud snails in some of the systems out there. So the next species we're going to talk about is snapping turtles. So we do have a good population of snapping turtles here in Washington County. Since it is native to parts of the US, it is not a federally listed invasive, but it is illegal to buy, sell, possess, or transport or release in the state of Oregon. So snapping turtles can prey on our native fish and wildlife. They can eat baby ducklings and our native amphibians. They're non-native turtles, and they outcompete our native turtles for food, basking, and nesting sites. And they may introduce new parasites and diseases to our native turtle populations and our waterways. I know that they are a big spreader of salmonella, so just keeping that in mind if you see them in the waterways. They inhabit warm, still, or slow-moving waters, such as ponds, lakes, streams, and rivers. They have an oval-shaped shell with jagged edges, which widen towards the back. Their shell color can vary from tan to olive and even to black, and they can reach up to 14 inches long, sometimes up to 18 inches. The top of their tail has a series of large triangular plates, which makes them kind of seem like they're a dinosaur. They have large heads and thick legs, and they're fast and aggressive and will bite. So one thing to note about snapping turtles is if you go to pick them up, you can only pick them up from the very back of their shell, because their neck, they can reach out and almost reach all the way to their tail. So just something to think about as you see them out there. We do have some populations on Fano Creek and make it all the way down to the river. So just things to think about as you're out there. We do have an active trapping for these species in coordination with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife because of how much damage these species can do to our native turtles that we also have in Fano Creek and some of our other waterways around here. Often this is found in freshwater lakes, rivers, canals, and ponds, especially those slow-moving areas. And if you find snapping turtles in Oregon, please report them, because they are not native here and they can spread those diseases pretty easily. The next turtle that we are going to talk about is the red-eared slider. It is very distinctive with that red stripe behind the eye. Though as they get older, some of the males can lose that red stripe, which can kind of make it hard to differentiate it from our natives because they also have yellow stripes on their head. And we'll show you some pictures of those as well. They have dark brown to olive shells with serrated edges. So you can kind of see at the back of this bottom photo, it's laying on its back of it or the top of its shell, but you can kind of see there's a little bit of serration at the back. There's yellow stripes on its head, neck, and legs, and its belly is yellow with some black spots. So you can see that in this bottom photo, those black spots on its belly. They compete with our native turtles for food, basking, and nesting spots. And the non-native turtles, just like the snapping turtle, can introduce diseases to our native turtle populations. And the red-eared slider is native to the eastern part of the US, but here in Oregon, it is illegal to buy, sell, possess, transport, or release in the state of Oregon. They prefer freshwater lakes and wetlands with abundant basking space, and they're most easily identified by that red marking behind their eye. These guys' shell can reach up to 16 inches long, and the underbelly is always yellow with some sort of black marking. Turtles, sometimes their belly of their shell, what is also called a plastron of their shell, is kind of unique for each individual turtle. So it's kind of like our fingerprints. So each turtle has slightly a different pattern on their belly, but they will always have some sort of yellow like background with black spots. The females of all of our turtles are larger than the males, but in the case of this, the red-eared slider, the males have longer claws on their front feet. Some areas where the red-eared sliders are found in Washington County are the Tualatin River, Dawson Creek, Fano Creek, and some of the surrounding smaller creeks and ponds that flow into those. So here's some of our Oregon native turtles. We have two native turtles here in Oregon, the northwestern pond turtle here on the left and the western painted turtle on the right. The pond turtles are found in ponds and lakes and can reach up to 9 inches long. They're dark brown to olive with a flecked pattern, and the bottom of their shell is cream with dark blotches. Their head and legs are dark brown to olive, so they don't have anything super distinguishing on them. They're just entirely a darker color. The painted turtles are found in slow-moving waterways, ponds, sloughs, and streams, and they can reach up to 10 inches long. The top of their shell is olive to green-black, and the bottom of their shell is a vibrant red with some black patterns to it. Their hind legs are olive with yellow stripes. So you can see here that western painted turtle kind of looks similar to the red-eared slider, but it is missing that red ear mark behind its eye. But some of the males, as they get, like I said, they start to lose that as they get older. So flipping it over and looking at its belly is a really distinguishing feature. And we can bring some pictures to show you all on Saturday of what the belly looks like of these. So there are some common aquatic native plants that we're going to talk about because we get reports of them often. So this plant here is floating pennywort, and it is a floating to creeping perennial that forms dense colonies, which is why often it's reported thinking it's an invasive plant. It's round, it has round leaves, and they're divided into 3 to 7 lobes. And the stems float on the water surface and root at each node. So this plant can take over some wetlands, but it is food for some of our ducks and other species that eat some of the vegetation on our ponds. It's easiest to see in June to September when the water levels are low. And this plant really does rely on nutrient inputs. So as people are fertilizing their yards or different golf courses or things like that, farmers, this plant can get really abundant in some of those waterways where there are some of those extra inputs. And so there's no need to report the species. We just wanted to make you aware of it, that you might see it out there. It's also can fragment and produce additional plants other places, but it is not a non-native species. It is a native species here in Oregon. And another one is mosquito fern. Mosquito ferns are native plants, which are common nuisance and can be mistaken for invasive plants. There are 2 species of mosquito fern that form dense mats that can impede access to recreation and alter flowing water in irrigation ditches, streams, and canals. But you can also find, you can most often find mosquito fern growing from spring until the first frost. It is a free-floating plant with tiny scale-like leaves. You can see in this top right photo, it kind of looks scaly there. The leaves range in color from green, pink to red. It's often seen in those warmer waters, and warmer winters increase populations in the spring, and colder winters decrease populations, but it can cover entire waterways, as you can see in this bottom photo. This is actually the Oregon Episcopal School pond, and you can see how heavy that infestation is. Ducks will swim right through it, and so will turtles, but it can cover entire waterways, making people think that it's an invasive species. And as our waters are getting warmer, it's allowing this species to expand its populations in some of these areas pretty rapidly. It prefers those shallow, slow-moving waters and along the edges of rivers, lakes, ponds, and wetlands. Okay, so now we've made it through all of these species, and on Saturday we will actually bring you some guidebooks that go over these species, and we'll also provide all of you copy of these slides just so you have them if you want to reference them. But now we're going to talk about how to report these species. So the best way to report these species is through the Oregon Invasive Species Hotline. So OregonInvasivesHotline.org. And then you click report now, and it walks you through some pretty easy things to fill out. So it's going to ask for your contact name, your first and last name, a phone number, and email, just so that if someone who's responding to you, they have a little bit more information and can get back in touch with you if there's any additional questions that they have. So then it'll ask you to tell us where you saw this population. So you just drag the pin to where you saw it, or enter the nearest address, or you can even provide longitude and latitude coordinates. Like if you drop a pin on Google, you can often pull up those coordinates. And if you don't want to drop this while you're out in the field or you don't have service, that's an easy way to come back and do this later. It'll then ask you for the category of these plants. So often so the zebra mussels, the quagga mussels, and the mud snails would all fall into the aquatic invertebrates. And then you've got the aquatic plants, most of the plants we talked about today. And then there's land plants and reptiles and amphibians, so those turtles. So you fill out that, and then a brief description of your find. So you can describe what species you think it is, or a description of the plant, or a way to get back to where you found the plant. So it's in a park, say it's a half mile down the trail next to this giant ash tree. So those are good notes for us to be able to follow up, or whoever's responding to it to follow up and get back to that population. You can attach photos. It's best to attach some photos if you can, especially two photos if possible. One photo from a distance so that the whole infestation or plant is in the photo, and a second photo with a close-up of the leaves, flowers, etc., something that is pretty descriptive of that plant that you saw. That helps someone idea and follow up on those infestations. These aren't great photos, but some photos here. You can see this population On the left, it kind of shows the whole population, and then on the right here is just a single one of those plants that's grown a little bit taller. So it's a good, even though these photos aren't great photos, they make it easy for someone to follow up on. There's a log in the photo, gives a good area to come back to, some identifying features. And then if you have any additional questions about your report or the person who's responding to your report. So we get reports for any of these species that are reported in Washington County, and there's different agencies depending on what type of critter it is. So if it's a land plant or some of those other categories, different people will respond in different areas of Oregon. But there will always be a response, which is a really nice resource to have. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some prevention, because prevention is the best control we have. So when you're out doing some kayaking or spending some time in the waters, make sure you clean, drain, and dry your water recreation equipment, your motorboat, your kayak, your stand-up paddle boards, etc., your fishing gear, any gear before entering new waterways. Don't move a mussel. So you can see in that upper right photo, those are either zebra or quagga mussels. They're hard to differentiate, but you can see how easily it is for those mussels to move around. They just attach on there and they attach real well. So make sure that to protect our natural state, to wash them off and wipe them out. So make sure you clean, you can play, and then you can clean, and then you can go on your next adventure. So areas to think about if you have a trailered boat, some of those dock lines, storage areas, if there's any water in them, your anchor, live wells, your bilge, your motor and propeller, your rollers and bunks on your trailer, axles, your trailer, especially where there's carpet to help protect your boat on it, the hull of your boat, and where your vehicle has come in contact with the water. So just things to think about as you're out there recreating and helping us keep these species from entering some of our waterways. And make sure you submit your reports to the hotline. So when you're not in the water, we ask that if possible, that you walk around infestations on a walk or hike if possible, so that you're not walking through those infestations. Those seeds are hitching a ride on you and moving on to new areas. Don't release pets or dump aquariums. Like Eli was saying, some of these plants are aquarium plants, and the Redeared Slider and snapping turtle are likely introduced into Oregon by people realizing that they're getting too big for their aquarium or can no longer take care of them, or goldfish. Don't let it loose. If you can't handle your pet anymore, be responsible, don't let it loose, and reach out to Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife or any agency, pet store in the area to see if they can help you find a new home for your pet. And thank you for watching. So that concludes our presentation. Please feel free to put your questions in the question and answer. And I know we have a question in here, and I will ask Tyler to answer this question that's in here, and I'll read it off to him. What is the best strategy for Japanese knotweed? How should clippings be disposed of? Is pulling, etc., a worthwhile effort or just a waste of time?
Yeah, that's really good questions there. So yeah, with any of the woody knotweed species, what we've found, typically the only thing that's really effective is herbicide. Digging it up or cutting it back, it doesn't really do anything to stop it. It just can oftentimes make it worse. Also, composting it is not a good idea, especially if you're composting like the green stems. Now, if they are, if they're brown and they're brittle, and they're dyed back, you could probably, you know, pile them and then eventually just put them in the trash or the green waste, sorry. But if they're fresh stems or fresh cuttings, you don't want to compost them. So you want to just get rid of them in the trash, put them in a bag in the trash. But I just wouldn't recommend trying to cut it because it's just going to make it worse. What happens is each of the little cuttings can form a new plant, and if you try to dig it up, if you miss any of the roots, and the roots can go down as deep as 7 feet and as far laterally as like 45 feet. There's chances are you're probably not going to get all the roots. So yeah, for us, we usually do stem injection with herbicide, or we'll do foliar treatment, depending on where the knotweed's growing. If it's in sensitive vegetation, usually the stem injection is the best method. But that's just our experience and kind of what we recommend. But I have heard some people that have tried to dig it up and they're very persistent with it. They go back and dig it up, and the thing with knotweed is you can never tell. It keeps coming back every year, so it's just ongoing battle. It's like how drawn out do you want to make it, and if you want to just try to nip it in the bud a little bit faster using herbicide, you definitely need to do multiple years of treatments. But I think it's a faster, more effective control method.
Additional
Was
questions?
was there anything else? Was that good? Okay.
Yeah, I think you answered all of it. Yeah. Any additional questions from the audience? And we'll be there on Saturday. And so we'll be happy to answer any additional questions there as well. Hopefully we'll get to see some of these, and hopefully not. Hopefully we don't see some of these, but hopefully we do, so that you guys can see them out there. Real plants.
There's one more from Jeff in the chat right now.
This question is from experience at Field Bridge Park in West Lynn along the Tualatin River. Clackamas Soil and Water doesn't plan to do much about it. I lead solve events there, so that's why he asked.
Oh, is this talking about the knotweed?
Yeah, Field Bridge does have quite a large population of knotweed. I've seen it there.
And nothing's being done about it?
Apparently Clackamas Soil and Water doesn't plan to do much about it.
Okay. Well, the one thing with knotweed to realize or to understand is that in order to get full control, oftentimes you need to have everyone on board when doing these treatments. And so, yeah, I don't know how many landowners are impacted, but it can be challenging trying to get everyone on board. Not everyone likes to have herbicide used on their properties, and it's something that we totally understand. But with knotweed, you really have to get like pretty much 100% participation to be effective. Because like I said earlier, every little fragment, every little root fragment or stem fragment can break off and go downstream and form new infestations.
Jeff, we can, if you're going to be there on Saturday, we can talk about some different strategies then as well, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, happy to help out and share, you know, kind of what we've found has worked, and you know, we're all in this together. We're all connected by the Tualatin River. All right. Well, if no one has any other questions, I look forward to seeing everyone at 9 o'clock at the Farmington launch on Saturday, and should be a nice day. So hopefully not going to get as hot as it is next week, but You know, it'll be nice to be out in the water, and hopefully we can see some of these plants, and yeah, looking forward to it. And I appreciate you all coming today, and yeah, we'll see you out in the water on Saturday.
Thank you, everybody. See ya.
Thank you.